In the early hours of August 25, 1945, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, 7 German prisoners of war were hanged one at a time in an elevator shaft, converted into a gallows, each man led in separately so that none of them would witness what had already happened to the one before him. They were U-boat sailors, captured after their submarines were sunk in the Atlantic, and they had been sentenced to death not for anything they had done as combatants, but for something they had done as prisoners. 15 months earlier, at a camp outside Phoenix, Arizona, a group of them had beaten and hanged a fellow German sailor in a shower stall, convinced he'd been informing on them to their American captors. The executions took place a little more than 2 weeks after Japan's surrender, meaning these 7 men were put to death for a wartime crime after the war itself, in every practical sense, had already ended. It remains the largest single mass execution in American legal history, and almost nobody outside specialist military historians has ever heard of it. That single fact should tell you something is badly wrong with the version of this story that circulates most widely online, the one where 400,000 German prisoners arrived in America, saw electric lights and full dinner plates, and were peacefully converted into grateful future Democrats by the sheer abundance of it all. That version isn't just oversimplified. Large parts of it appear to be invented outright. Fabricated diary quotes attributed to soldiers who don't show up in any archive, statistics with a precision no wartime survey could have actually produced, named officers and camp commanders who leave no trace in the actual unit rosters or National Archives holdings for the units they're supposedly attached to, and a tidy story of mass ideological conversion that the historians who've spent their careers studying this subject, Arnold, Kramer, and Ron Robin, chief among them, don't actually support in their own published research. The real story of German POWs in America is genuinely remarkable on its own terms, without needing any of that invention. It's also considerably darker, stranger, and more contested than the version built for maximum feel-good virality. The scale of the program itself is not in dispute. Beginning in earnest in 1943, the United States took in roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, the overwhelming majority of them German, and housed them in something close to 700 camps, spread across nearly every state in the country except a small handful, including Nevada and Vermont, that never hosted one. Most of these camps were thrown together quickly, often in a matter of a few months, using standardized army barracks, designs, and cheap, readily available lumber, frequently sited in rural areas of the South and Southwest, where the climate reduced heating costs, and where existing military installations already had land and infrastructure to expand from. The result was a genuinely uneven system, a smaller number of large, well-documented base camps holding several thousand men each, feeding a much larger and more loosely tracked network of branch camps, sometimes holding as few as a couple hundred prisoners, set up specifically near whatever farm or factory needed the seasonal labor. That decentralization is part of why comprehensive, reliable statistics about camp life are harder to pin down with confidence than the tidy numbers online often suggest. Record-keeping quality varied enormously between a major installation with a permanent administrative staff and a temporary branch camp, assembled for a single harvest season and dismantled a few months later. The first large wave arrived on the heels of the Axis collapse in Tunisia that May, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's own former command, the Afrika Korps, along with attached Italian units, surrendered wholesale under General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's own replacement, somewhere between 250 and 275,000 men taken prisoner in a matter of days as scattered German and Italian formations gave up across the North African front. The exact final count blurred by units still trickling in to surrender over the following week. Shipping that many men across an ocean was itself a logistical afterthought rather than a plan. American Liberty ships that had carried war material to North Africa needed cargo for the return voyage rather than sailing back empty, and prisoners filled that gap, moving north across the Atlantic on the same vessels that had, weeks earlier, been hauling ammunition and rations in the opposite direction. It's true, and worth pausing on, that many of these men crossed the Atlantic in conditions considerably better than anything they'd experienced as soldiers in the desert, and that their first sight of the American coastline, intact cities, lit windows, civilian cars and parking lots, none of it blacked out or bombed, did genuinely rattle men who had spent years being told American industry was a house of cards. I think it's worth being precise about why that sight actually mattered, rather than just asserting that it did. These were soldiers who had fought a desert campaign chronically short of fuel, spare parts, and reliable supply, against an enemy whose material advantage had become obvious to junior officers, well before Rommel's own headquarters was willing to say so out loud. Arriving in a country that showed no visible sign of wartime strain at all, no rationed streetlights, no bombed rail yards, produce stands stocked as though there were no war on at all, wasn't simply impressive. For men who had just spent years being told, as a matter of settled propaganda, that this specific country was too soft, too divided, and too materially exhausted to sustain a real war effort, it was a direct, personal contradiction of something they'd been assured was settled fact. That kind of contradiction does real psychological work. It doesn't require inventing named individuals and fabricated diary entries to make the point land. American conditions inside the camps themselves were, by any honest comparison with a German soldier's actual wartime experience, genuinely good, a fact the Geneva Convention required, and that the U.S. government had every practical incentive to honor, since German-held American and British prisoners depended on reciprocal treatment. Camps built quickly across Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and dozens of other states typically included wooden barracks with electric lighting, hot water, camp hospitals, and rations that met or exceeded American military nutritional standards. A genuinely striking contrast for men who had, in many cases, spent their final months of combat on badly reduced supply lines. Camp Hearn in Texas, one of the larger and better documented facilities, held close to 5,000 men at its peak, and became something close to a small, self-sufficient town behind wire. Prisoners built their own camp theater, staged full orchestral concerts and operas using instruments the Army allowed them to order, ran a fine arts program that produced murals and sculpture still preserved today, and organized soccer leagues competitive enough that some camps fielded genuinely skilled former semi-professional players. Much of what's known about daily camp life in this kind of detail comes specifically from Camp Hearn's survival as a physical site. Unlike most wartime POW camps, which were dismantled or repurposed within a few years of the war's end, Hearn's grounds were preserved well enough that archaeologists and historians spent years excavating the site, starting in the 1990s, recovering everything from handmade chess sets to fragments of the prisoners' own artwork. And the camp now operates as a small public museum, one of the only places in the country where a visitor can actually walk the physical ground this story took place on, rather than read about it secondhand. Prisoners published their own camp newspapers independent of the later official re-education effort, and in a fair number of camps were eventually sent out to work on local farms and in factories under labor shortage provisions that technically complied with, if occasionally stretched, the letter of the Geneva Convention's restrictions on prisoner labor. At peak, close to 100,000 German POWs were working outside the wire on any given day nationwide, filling gaps left by American men serving overseas. None of that is myth. Documented escape attempts across the entire wartime program numbered only in the low thousands, against a prisoner population approaching 500,000. And essentially, none of those attempts resulted in a prisoner successfully reaching another country. A genuinely remarkable record of quiet, uneventful custody, at least on the surface. Underneath that calm surface sat something the tidy version of this story leaves out almost entirely, and it's the part that actually makes the story worth telling honestly, rather than as propaganda. American camp administrators, in the early years of the program especially, made almost no attempt to separate committed Nazi ideologues from ordinary conscripts, anti-Nazi Germans, or men who simply wanted the war to end quietly. That failure to screen prisoners let hardline Nazi cliques inside several camps organize themselves into something close to a shadow military hierarchy, complete with informal courts-martial, enforced discipline, and, in a number of documented cases, outright murder of fellow prisoners suspected of disloyalty, defeatism, or informing on their campmates to American guards. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943, a prisoner named Johannes Kunze, an Afrika Korps veteran who had reportedly made openly defeatist remarks and was suspected of passing information to American officers, was put through a kangaroo trial staged by roughly 200 fellow prisoners and beaten to death for it. At Camp Aiken, South Carolina, in the spring of 1944, a prisoner named Horst Gunther was strangled by 2 other Germans over similar suspicions, his body strung up afterward to make the killing look like a suicide. At Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, that same March, a prisoner named Hans Geller was beaten so badly by another POW that he died the following day. And at Papago Park, Arizona, in March 1944, a group of German U-boat sailors held a drumhead trial within hours of a new prisoner's arrival, Werner Drexler, a submariner who had, in fact, been cooperating with American interrogators, and hanged him in a shower block before American guards could intervene. Investigators eventually identified and convicted 15 German POWs across these separate cases. 14 of them were executed by the U.S. military. The 7 men in the Drexler case at Leavenworth in August 1945, the rest in earlier and later proceedings, in what remains, taken together, the largest mass execution ever carried out under American law. The case became, briefly, an actual diplomatic flashpoint. When the U.S. War Department eventually shared the Tonkawa court records with the German government through neutral channels, German military lawyers reviewed the case, rejected its findings, and demanded the executions be halted. Rather than wait for an American response, German military authorities in the field took their own retaliatory action. On December 29th and 30th, 1944, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, German Army and SS units convened secret drumhead tribunals of their own against a group of American prisoners, sentencing 15 of them to death on charges that, by most post-war accounts, amounted to little more than minor infractions. 2 men, for instance, had reportedly done nothing more than briefly block a German sergeant's path. The threatened American executions and the German retaliatory sentences became entangled in exactly the kind of grim tit-for-tat calculation that made military lawyers on both sides nervous for the rest of the war. And President Truman himself, in July 1945, personally reviewed and confirmed all but one of the death sentences against the German POWs, while the country was simultaneously absorbed in the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan. None of that means the broader Geneva Convention compliance or the comparatively humane general conditions were somehow fake. Both things were simultaneously true, which is precisely the point. The same camp system capable of feeding prisoners better than they'd eaten as soldiers, and of treating the overwhelming majority of them without incident for the duration of the war, was also, for a period, incapable of protecting individual prisoners from an internal Nazi terror campaign operating inside the wire with almost no interference. American authorities eventually responded by sorting prisoners more deliberately, segregating identified hardline Nazis into dedicated camps, most famously Camp Alva in Oklahoma, nicknamed by its own inmates Alcatraz North for how tightly it was run. But that sorting came only after several men had already been murdered by their own countrymen for the crime of wanting the war to end. Alva was built specifically to hold the roughly 2,000 prisoners. American intelligence officers judged the most ideologically committed and the most likely to intimidate or endanger other POWs if left in a general population camp, and it operated under noticeably stricter security than most of the wider system, a tacit admission, arriving well over a year into the program, that simply feeding and housing prisoners humanely had never been sufficient on its own to guarantee their safety from each other. Escape statistics for the program as a whole were genuinely low, but the single most remarkable escape story from the entire war took 40 years to actually conclude, and it belongs to a former Afrika Korps sergeant named Georg Gartner. Captured in Tunisia in 1943 and eventually held at Camp Deming, New Mexico, Gartner cut through the camp's barbed wire and escaped in September 1945, weeks after Germany's own surrender, not to evade combat, but specifically to avoid forced repatriation to his home region of Lower Silesia, which had just been absorbed into Soviet-controlled Poland, and which, he had every reason to believe, would mean deportation, forced labor, or worse, for anyone sent back there as a German. He made his way to California under a new identity, Dennis Wiles, working first as a migrant laborer before eventually becoming a ski instructor and tennis pro well known enough in his adopted community to organize celebrity charity tournaments. He married an American woman in the early 1960s without ever telling her his real name or his actual history, moved at least 20 times over 4 decades, specifically to avoid being recognized, and lived, by his own later account, in a state of quiet, permanent low-grade fear that lasted longer than most actual prison sentences would have. In September 1985, at 64 years old, he finally turned himself in to federal immigration authorities voluntarily, ending what the FBI itself had, at various points, treated as an active manhunt. Field offices had reportedly been instructed for years to check local phone directories for his real name. By the time he surrendered, the statute of limitations and the changed diplomatic reality of the post-war decades meant he faced essentially no legal consequence at all. He died in Colorado in 2013, having spent most of his adult life as an American citizen under a name that wasn't his, a fact his own wife hadn't known until he chose to tell her. His decision to surrender was reportedly prompted less by a change of heart than by a German television producer who had located an old file on his case in a Berlin archive and tracked him down in Colorado before he could be exposed involuntarily. Gartner chose to come forward on his own terms rather than be discovered. He later wrote a memoir about the decades he spent in hiding, and a German documentary crew produced a film about his life in 1986, built around the same central strangeness his own story keeps returning to. A fugitive who spent 40 years successfully impersonating the ordinary, unremarkable American life he had, technically, been sentenced to observe from behind a fence. I don't know a cleaner illustration than Gartner's story of how genuinely strange this entire chapter of the war actually was, once you stop trying to force it into either a triumphant or a purely dark narrative. Here was a man who fled not the war itself, which had already ended, but the specific post-war map that redrew his own hometown into someone else's country, and who then spent 40 years successfully passing as an ordinary member of the very society he'd supposedly needed converting to. The re-education effort that the popular version of this story treats as a triumphant, coordinated program of ideological conversion was real, but its actual documented effectiveness was far more modest and far more contested among the historians who've studied it than the story usually lets on. Beginning in 1945, the War Department's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, known internally, half-jokingly as the Factory, set up a deliberately obscure operation at a cluster of small coastal forts in Rhode Island, Fort Kearny chief among them, where a hand-picked group of American academics worked alongside a smaller group of screened, generally anti-Nazi German prisoners to produce pro-democracy material for distribution across the wider camp system. Its centerpiece was a German-language newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, written by German prisoners for German prisoners, deliberately mixing genuine literary and cultural content with more overtly democratic political material so it wouldn't read as blunt propaganda. I don't think the most interesting part of that program is the newspaper itself, though. It's what became of the men who wrote it. Der Ruf's actual editorial staff included figures like Hans Werner Richter and Alfred Andersch, both anti-Nazi prisoners recruited specifically because American officers judged them reliable enough to shape the paper's content without direct daily oversight. Several of Der Ruf's own prisoner editors, once repatriated to occupied Germany after the war, went on to found a loose literary circle that came to be known simply as Group 47, named for the year of its first informal gathering, a collective that, over the following 2 decades, effectively shaped the entire post-war West German literary scene and produced, among others, 2 future Nobel laureates in literature, Heinrich Böll and Günter Grass, whose novel The Tin Drum remains one of the defining works of post-war German fiction. That's a genuinely remarkable, well-documented legacy for a wartime propaganda sheet printed for a captive audience behind barbed wire in Rhode Island. And it's worth noting explicitly that the connection runs the opposite direction from what the tidier version of this story usually implies. It wasn't that American abundance converted these men to democracy so much as that the specific, deliberate act of writing and editing that newspaper, alongside other prisoners who already shared their politics, gave a small group of already anti-Nazi Germans an organizational and literary foothold they carried directly into post-war German cultural life. What's considerably less well supported is the broader claim that the re-education program itself successfully converted the general prisoner population into committed Democrats. Post-war surveys of camp populations and the assessment of historians who've studied the Special Projects Division closely, Arnold Kramers and Ron Robbins' work chief among them, generally concluded that the program's material appealed mainly to an already atypical, more educated slice of the prisoner population, that Der Ruf itself was frequently seen by ordinary POWs as too literary and too removed from actual camp life to hold much interest, and that most prisoners' underlying political views shifted little as a direct result of anything the factory produced. The broader labor program, at least, is easier to verify plainly. Roughly 100,000 German prisoners at any given time were eventually working outside the wire under supervised contracts, filling wartime agricultural and light industrial labor shortages across dozens of states, picking cotton in Texas and Arkansas, harvesting sugar beets across the Great Plains, states where German-American farming communities had existed for generations, working canneries and packing plants in the Midwest, and cutting pulpwood in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and New England, almost always under the direct supervision of a small detachment of American guards, and paid a modest daily wage in scrip redeemable at camp canteens rather than actual currency, exactly as the Geneva Convention required for enlisted prisoners assigned non-military labor. Farmers who contracted for POW labor paid the government directly rather than the prisoners themselves, at rates generally set to match local civilian wages, which meant the labor program functioned less as forced exploitation in the crudest sense and more as a genuinely large-scale, if involuntary, stopgap workforce filling a shortage created by roughly 16 million American men serving overseas. The work itself was genuinely important. Wartime harvests, particularly, would have gone unharvested in some regions without it, and genuinely formative for the prisoners who did it, since farm labor put ordinary German soldiers into daily, informal contact with American civilians in a way camp life alone never could. Whether that daily contact reliably produced ideological transformation, as opposed to simple mutual familiarity between 2 groups of tired, mostly apolitical working men, is exactly the kind of claim that's easy to overstate in hindsight and considerably harder to actually document from the period itself. By the time repatriation began in earnest after Germany's surrender, something over 350,000 German prisoners had passed through the American camp system, and what actually happened to a great many of them next complicates the uplifting ending the story usually gets given. Rather than sending former prisoners straight home once the fighting stopped, the United States transferred roughly 740,000 German POWs, a number that includes men originally held both in America and in occupied Europe, directly into continued forced labor under British and French control, citing reconstruction needs and existing wartime agreements, rather than anything resembling a clean humanitarian handoff. Conditions under French administration in particular were, by multiple documented accounts, considerably harsher than anything these men had experienced in the American camp system. Men housed in provisional camps along the Rhine and in Normandy on rations sometimes as low as 1,000 to 1,500 calories a day. well below what sustained heavy reconstruction labor, like minefield clearance and rubble removal, actually required, with weight losses averaging 10 to 15 kilograms over a period of months, and documented outbreaks of typhus in some of the worst camps. Public pressure in both Britain and France eventually mounted against what critics in the British press and Parliament openly started calling slave labor by 1946 and 1947, and the practice wound down only gradually. Britain didn't complete its own repatriations until late 1948, 3.5 years after Germany's surrender, and a portion of the men held there, several tens of thousands, ultimately chose to stay in Britain permanently rather than return to a divided, devastated homeland. It's a detail that sits uncomfortably next to any version of this story built purely around American generosity, precisely because it wasn't the same story at all. Many of the men who'd spent their American captivity eating better than they had, as frontline soldiers went on to spend a further year or more after the war's actual end in considerably worse conditions than the ones that had supposedly converted them. A genuine minority of former POWs did eventually return to the United States after the war, some through formal immigration programs, some through personal connections made during their captivity, and a handful of individual former prisoners did go on to hold notable post-war roles in West German public life, though the specific tidy causal chain sometimes drawn from American captivity directly to post-war German democratic leadership is considerably harder to establish for any single named individual than the more romantic tellings of this story suggest, and I'd treat any specific biography built entirely around that claim with real skepticism unless it's independently sourced. What actually shaped post-war West Germany's recovery and its eventual democratic stability was an enormously complicated mix of total military defeat, Allied occupation policy, direct economic reconstruction through the Marshall Plan, which channeled roughly $13 billion into rebuilding Western European economies between 1948 and 1952, West Germany among the largest recipients, and a broader generational reckoning with Nazism that played out over decades rather than months, through formal denazification tribunals in the occupation years, through the slower and more painful process of ordinary Germans confronting what their own neighbors, relatives, and sometimes they themselves had done or allowed, and eventually through a student-led reckoning in the late 1960s that forced a much harder public conversation about the war than the immediate post-war occupation authorities had generally managed. Historians still actively debate how each of those threads actually interacted, and how much weight to assign any single one of them. The POW camp experience was a genuine, meaningful thread inside the much larger fabric for the several 100,000 men who lived through it. It was never, on its own, the singular hidden cause of Germany's post-war transformation that the neatest version of this story wants it to be. The competitor version of this story leans heavily on a scene of American families inviting German prisoners to Christmas dinner as proof of a nation's overwhelming, disarming generosity. And while wartime regulations in most American camps actually restricted that kind of direct civilian fraternization far more tightly than the story implies, something close to that scene did genuinely play out on the British side of the same story a couple of years later. As Christmas 1946 approached, with hundreds of thousands of German prisoners still held in Britain well after the war's end, public discomfort with the arrangement had grown loud enough that authorities temporarily relaxed the rules against fraternization specifically for the holiday. At Saffron Walden, a clergyman named Reverend Roy Sinker publicly dubbed the prisoners at a nearby camp ambassadors in chains, and encouraged local families to invite them into their homes for the day. A genuinely striking, well-documented act of post-war reconciliation, offered not by the country that had captured these men, but by ordinary civilians living beside a camp holding soldiers who had, months earlier, still been trying to kill their own relatives. It's a real story with essentially the same emotional shape as the fabricated American Christmas scene, worth noting precisely because the genuine version of it happened in Britain rather than America, and grew out of public unease about prolonged captivity rather than confident abundance. Britain ran its own parallel program for the roughly 400,000 German prisoners it held by 1946, built around similar assumptions: controlled exposure to democratic civic life, screen newspapers, supervised discussion groups, and France introduced a comparable initiative in February 1947, modeled directly on the British approach. British historians, studying their own version of the program, have reached essentially the same tentative conclusion American historians reached about the factory: that systematic evidence of any lasting ideological transformation is thin, that the programs were never remotely altruistic to begin with, since every Allied power running one had its own post-war political interest in a friendlier, more pliable German population, and that whatever genuine change in attitude did occur among returning prisoners is extremely difficult to separate from the much larger, blunter forces of total defeat, years of occupation, and the sheer scale of what Germany had to rebuild. Set against how the war's other major combatants treated prisoners, the American system's basic humanity becomes easier to appreciate without needing to inflate it into propaganda. Soviet POW camps holding German prisoners saw death rates that, by even conservative post-war estimates, ran into the hundreds of thousands, driven by starvation rations, brutal forced labor in mines and construction projects, and years of captivity that stretched past 1955 for the last returning prisoners. German camps holding Soviet prisoners were considerably worse still. Historians generally estimate that more than half of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet POWs taken by Germany died in captivity, a death toll on a scale that puts it alongside the deliberate mass killings of the Holocaust, rather than in the same category as conventional wartime imprisonment. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, from the Bataan Death March onward, produced its own well-documented record of systematic starvation, forced labor, and outright massacre. Against that backdrop, a German POW system in America with a documented mortality rate under 0.5%, regular Red Cross inspections, and a food supply generous enough to become the subject of prisoner complaints about waste rather than hunger, genuinely was exceptional. One of the only prisoner of war systems of the entire war that actually followed the Geneva Convention's basic terms in practice rather than merely on paper. Even that comparison has its own limits, though. It's worth remembering that Geneva Convention compliance for German POWs in American hands was, at least in part, a matter of calculated reciprocity rather than pure principle. American and British prisoners held by Germany depended directly on the German government believing its own captured soldiers were being treated well enough that mistreating Allied prisoners in return would carry a real cost. That's not a cynical footnote, so much as an accurate description of how the Geneva Convention system was actually designed to function during total war. Less an appeal to universal decency than a structure of mutual hostage-taking that happened, in this particular case, to produce genuinely humane outcomes for the men caught inside it. One piece of the re-education program's actual toolkit is worth describing honestly rather than skipping past, because it complicates any simple story about persuasion through prosperity. Alongside the literary and cultural material distributed through Der Ruf, camp officials in 1945 began screening prisoners' documentary footage shot by American and British film crews during the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, material that had, by that point, already shocked audiences of American soldiers and civilians alike. For many German prisoners, held safely behind wire in Texas or Oklahoma or Arizona for the better part of 2 years, this was their first exposure to unambiguous visual evidence of what their own government had actually been doing while they fought a conventional war against American and British forces on entirely separate fronts. Some prisoners, according to camp officials' contemporary reports, initially dismissed the footage as fabricated propaganda, no different in kind from the material they'd been raised on inside the Reich. Confirmation eventually arrived for most of them anyway, whether through further documentation, through letters from home once postal contact resumed, or simply through the sheer scale and consistency of what multiple independent Allied sources were reporting from different camps across a devastated Germany. That confrontation with direct evidence of the Holocaust, not comparative statistics about factory output or grocery abundance, is what actually appears, across the historical record, to have done the most serious ideological work on prisoners who arrived skeptical of everything else they were shown. It's also worth being honest about who these prisoners actually were, since the popular version of this story tends to flatten them into a single, undifferentiated mass of Nazi true believers waiting to be converted. The German POW population held in America was, in reality, drawn from every corner of a national conscript army. Career Wehrmacht officers and career sailors alongside teenage draftees barely out of school, committed party members alongside men who had never joined the Nazi party at all and had simply been called up like millions of others, urban factory workers alongside farmers' sons who had rarely left their home villages before the war put them on a troop transport to North Africa. Most of these men, by the most careful post-war assessments, were neither the fanatics of wartime propaganda nor the eager future Democrats of the feel-good retelling. They were simply soldiers, pulled out of a losing war years before it ended, waiting out the rest of it in conditions considerably better than the ones they'd left, and mostly hoping, like soldiers in any army in any century, to eventually go home. None of that fits neatly onto a recruitment poster or a feel-good headline, which is probably the simplest explanation for why the fabricated version keeps circulating instead of the real one. A story about abundance quietly defeating an ideology is satisfying in a way that a story about competing, contradictory truths inside the same barbed wire perimeter is not. It resolves cleanly, it flatters the country telling it, and it doesn't require holding two uncomfortable facts in your head at once. The actual historical record offers no such resolution. It offers instead several 100,000 individual men, each arriving with his own mix of conviction, exhaustion, and simple confusion about how he'd ended up an ocean away from a war that, for him personally, was already over. That's a harder story to tell in 6 minutes than the fabricated one. It's also, as far as the actual documentary record shows, the one that's true. If you had a relative who was held as a POW anywhere during the war, German, Italian, Japanese, on any side of any front, I'd genuinely like to hear what they told you about it in the comments, because the actual lived experience inside these camps was messier, more varied, and considerably more human than either the propaganda version or the purely dark version manages to capture on its own.